All right, welcome. This afternoon, hope everyone's having a great day. This presentation is Making It Work, Early Childhood and PBIS. I'm Anna Winokur, and I'm here today with Lisa Fox. We're with the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. We're out of the University of South Florida. So just some quick things to remember. I'm sure you saw this in your last presentation, your last session, but I did just want to remind you that if you did have questions for the presenters, to go to the polls tab, where we did save some time at the end to make sure that you had opportunity to ask questions. There are times where we will encourage you to type in the chat box, and we'll prompt you when to do that. But we just want to make sure that everybody gets as much as they can out of the session. So we're just going to ask if you could just limit some of those distractions and just make sure that as we are sharing, if you are typing in the chat, that we're using that inclusive language and that we're maintaining that professionalism. So our objectives for our session today, we'd like by the end of the session for you all to be able to identify strategies so that you can effectively include your pre-K classrooms into what you're doing with school-wide PBIS. Also identify resources that can help support implementation in early childhood classrooms, so materials that are developmentally appropriate for our youngest learners. And then lastly, that you'll identify some data tools that'll monitor the implementation of what's happening within your classroom or your school or program, along with some behavioral outcomes. So to get us started, in the chat box, if you don't mind, just let us know what your role is in working with young children, along with reflecting on what is one idea or resource that you hope to gain during today's session. So we'll give you a minute to just go ahead and type in the chat box, whatever your role might be. And hopefully, if you came looking for something specific, that we will be able to share that with you. If not, we can always help you to locate items at the end. Okay. So I'm just going to start off. This is telling you some things that you already know, but we're going to look at the similarities and differences between school-wide PBIS and early childhood PBIS. So when we think about positive behavior interventions and support, we're thinking about those effective environments so that we're promoting positive behavior. We're thinking of a collaborative approach, an assessment-based approach, so that when we do encounter any kind of problem behavior, we have effective interventions. And then lastly, we're thinking about that emphasis on preventing and what are we going to teach, and then how are we going to reinforce when we see that behavior. So keeping that in mind, we're going to think about if those are some three big ideas around PBIS, how is that similar to what we're going to talk about today, and then where those differences might be. So we know that there's two different things to think about. There's differences in children and there's differences in the environment. So we're thinking about the developmental ages of young children, and that just due to the age and their developmental level, meltdowns are expected when we're working with really young children. We know they learn best through play, through planned, meaningful, engaging activities, also with routines. Thinking about our youngest children too, they're coming to school often for the very first time. So they might have very limited social and emotional skills, which is different if you think about your older children who might be on an elementary school campus. There's also differences in that environment. Even the physical structure of the classroom, typically when we're in early childhood classrooms, we see open space with different centers. There's different activities, there's nap time, there's circle, where we might not see that in the older grades. When we're working with early childhood, there might be different qualifications or professional development expectations, and there might be some different expectations for family involvement, along with how are we supporting families to use those strategies and practices that we use at school to use at home. And then there are reinforcement systems are going to look different for early childhood. So we are talking about today PBIS along with the pyramid model framework, and both are multi-tiered systems to support children to promote positive behavior and to prevent challenging behavior. But we're going to focus more on the pyramid model, which is also a set of developmentally appropriate practices for young children. So we'll go through what each of the different tiers, along with sharing with you some resources. So we'll think about the whole time as we're talking, where might that fit into what you're doing currently with school-wide PBIS? So while they might seem like they're different pieces to a puzzle, they really complement each other well. And one of our goals is by the end of the session, you'll have a better understanding or a better picture in your mind of what that could really look like. Because oftentimes when we are thinking about our pre-K classrooms, especially if they're on an elementary school classroom, they're often like an island by themselves. And usually when I say that, there's a lot of early childhood educators who nod. Yes, we are sort of left to our own devices. And that might not be intentional. It might just be from how things have been on campus for a while. But our goal is to give you some of that help that you might need to make sure that you are using strategies that are appropriate for young children. So if you're not familiar with the pyramid model, we're thinking about our universal promotion for social emotional competencies, and we teach that to all children. We also think about those targeted social emotional supports, which are also taught to all children, but we are also thinking too about that secondary prevention. So what children might need, some additional supports, additional practice, maybe a different way of instruction to make sure that they're successful. And then at the top, we have that intensive intervention, which hopefully would be few children because we've put so many good foundational pieces in place. But what's really important to think about is that social emotional learning is at the core for all the tiers. So we're always keeping that social emotional learning in mind as we're teaching, as we are building those nurturing responsive relationships, creating those environments, along with those targeted social emotional supports and that intensive intervention. So all of the resources we're going to show you today, you can access from challengingbehavior.org. You'll notice that we'll explain some the idea behind the strategy or the practice, and then we'll share some resources, but in no way is it exhaustive of all of the resources. We'd be here for a really long time. But I did want to make sure that if you were looking for something, probably the best way to do that too is I always use the search button, but I'll also show you where you can find it through the drop down as well. So we're going to think about this with some basic assumptions when we're thinking about behavior. And we're going to move forward thinking about that behavior. Challenging behavior usually has some kind of message. Children are trying to tell us something, but they might be missing either those communication skills or those social skills to be able to ask for it in a way that we would think is appropriate for school. And if we see that behavior persist over time, that usually means it's working for that child, right? I wouldn't keep engaging in that behavior if it wasn't actually working for me. So we always think about those assumptions as we're working with our young children. So thinking about when we talked about the differences in developmental level, those are the assumptions we're making. So we're thinking about the goal of the pyramid. We're promoting children's success. So we're going back to that environment where every child who walks through that door feels good about coming to school, knows that they're wanted in that classroom, and feel really welcomed. We're going to talk a little bit more too about designing an environment that promotes child engagement. So how do we make the classroom a place that is engaging, that children want to come and learn? And we also know that the more we can increase that engagement, the less likely children will engage in challenging behavior. And our big focus is on teaching children what we want them to do as opposed to what not to do. And if we focus on teaching those skills, again, we would see that decrease in challenging behaviors. So if you were interested in some outcomes, some data around the pyramid model, if you're not already familiar with it, these are two great infographics that can help you to really see when we're talking about positive outcomes, exactly what we're meaning by that. And you can see that there's also some some testimonial as well as to what people really love about the pyramid. And then there's a second resource that I wanted to direct you to around promoting teacher retention using pyramid model practices. I think that's something that's on everybody's mind right now, more than ever. But if you were looking for, I'm going to go back to my school and I want to talk about the positive outcomes of pyramid model, these are two really good resources that you might want to refer to for folks who might not be as familiar. So we're going to start off by talking about what we mean by universal promotion. What do we teach all children? And we're thinking about first, of course, at the very bottom is our effective workforce. So we need to have our professionals who are there, who are eager to teach young children and eager to support young children in social emotional learning. But at the base of the pyramid, we're going to talk about nurturing and responsive relationships. So not only teacher and child relationships, but you also want to think about teacher family relationships and relationships among all the adults who are in the classroom. Because we know that this is essential. Those pieces are essential to healthy social development. And one of those things that I had mentioned earlier is that family involvement might look different. This includes relationships with those families. And you'll notice for every tier that we talk about how you involve families. So the focus really is, what are those interactions between caregivers and children? And again, caregivers and families, and caregivers and other caregivers they're working with. So it's all about relationships. These are two really great pictures of thinking about how can we promote relationships between children. We'll talk a little bit more about that with friendship skills, but also families. And it's a really great quote that parents need to know that we care before they care what we know. So we're building those relationships with families. We're getting to know the families. We're going to make sure that we are being supportive of families and then sharing information both ways, bi-directional information, right? They share with us, we share with them, and also provide them some resources or materials so that they have a good understanding of what you're teaching in terms of social emotional in your classroom. So when we partner with families, we know that that's really the foundation for success. It's embedded in everything we do. And as I mentioned, it is a partnership at every tier. We don't just wait until there's a problem to start building relationships with families. So these, I'm going to show you this one first in English, and then there's another, there's the same version, but translated in Spanish. But this is a really great way of thinking about all about my child. And if you'll notice what might be a little bit different about this one than a traditional all about my child that you might see is we do ask if the child feels frustrated. We want to know those things. We want to know when that child feels frustrated, what are some of those activities? And to help my child calm down or feel better, what are some of those self-regulation strategies that are already working at home? We always talk about not recreating the wheel. So if we already know some things that help and work with that child, we don't have to guess. We don't have to do a lot of trial and error. We can incorporate that in the classroom as well. So you'll see that this is the same document in Spanish, and it comes right from that challengingbehavior.org. So a lot of what we're going to share here, those drop-down menus. So if you're looking for some additional resources, if you're familiar with Positive Solutions for Families, it just got a whole new refresh, and it's a whole new makeover from top to bottom. I really encourage you to spend some time looking through those resources. It's specifically for families and specifically to help them to incorporate those practices that we know work at home. So you'll see the resources are intended for families at home. Some of the choices have changed based on what activities children might do at home. There's a wealth of information there. So I really encourage you to take a look if you're looking for ideas of partnering with families. So in the chat box, we're going to just ask, when we ask these questions, we're going to use the chat box so that you all can interact with each other and sort of get ideas of strategies or some kind of activity that other folks do. But if you had a specific question for us, like maybe going back to that, I need a resource, if you could use the polls, then we'll be able to get that at the end. But we'd really like for you to type in the chat box ways that you build relationships with families so that you all can be interacting with each other. All right. So hopefully you're typing away. So when we think about responsive relationship practices, we're thinking about three core pieces. We're talking about those supportive conversations where we're talking with children and meaningful conversations, meaningful to them, learning about their life. We're thinking about positive attention and positive descriptive feedback are really important when we're thinking about building those relationships. And we'll sort of break that down a little bit more. So if you're looking for something around how do I increase positive descriptive feedback, or maybe even something that I could provide to families so that they can think about some sentence starters of how could they use more positive descriptive feedback at home. This is a great resource. It gives you lots of different ideas, good resource for teachers and families. It also gives you some nonverbal encouragement ideas, which I think is terrific because we know not all children really appreciate when it's verbal. Sometimes they just want that little thumbs up, or they want something, a little happy dance, something that just that they know that you noticed that they were doing something that you had taught them to do, or something that was meeting those expectations in the classroom. This document has a couple pages to it, but I just wanted to point out the first page because it really does talk about how do you give positive descriptive feedback, and to give some more direction. And then the next pages that follow that will give you some additional ideas. But sometimes I think we get in the habit as teachers of thinking we do a really great job of positive descriptive feedback. And it's always nice to stop and sort of calibrate and make sure that we're keeping up with as much as we think we are. So in the chat box, if you don't mind, we're going to ask what are some other ways you increase the use of positive descriptive feedback. It's always nice to know how can we support teachers to increase that specific practice. All right, so I'm just going to let you type for it a little bit, but I'm going to move on so you can look and see what your colleagues are doing. But for the sake of time, we'll keep going on. So we talked about environments. We want to really think about the design of our environments. Are children engaged? Do they know the routines and expectations? Have they been taught? Have they practiced? Have they been retaught? Have they been given positive descriptive feedback when they are following the routines or demonstrating expectations? Adults have time to have meaningful conversations with children. So do we see adults sitting with children and talking with them beyond just what's happening with direct teaching? If we do these things, then we will be less likely to see challenging behavior within our classrooms. So making sure that that engagement is there, that our centers, our instruction, our materials are engaging for children, and really thinking about have we spent time ourselves breaking down what the routine is and then teaching it to children. So we're thinking about what are those essentials? What are the things that are really critical to getting started with the pyramid model and implementation? And this is something that you can think about if you're currently a classroom teacher, thinking about what do I already do? But we're going to go through, or if you're a coach supporting teachers or a director or administrator, but we're going to go over 5 components and then thinking about what are those materials or environmental considerations, because we want to consider all children. And when we do this, it really helps to build that foundation for stronger practices. It's really what you would build from. And it's what we always encourage classrooms to start with when they're starting with the pyramid model. So I know this is 6 because we just separated out the expectations and rules, but I did want to just show you that we're thinking about that visual schedule. And one of those pieces that we know is predictable, and the more predictable our environment is, then the more likely children are to be successful. Thinking about if we're using a behavior management system, is it something that's positive? Is the physical environment in my room really promote engagement, meaning that do children have the opportunity to talk to each other? Is it engaging? Can I access materials? Sometimes it's as simple as re-examining that environment to help put things in place. When we walk in the room, are families visually represented? Do we notice that there's a spot in the room or maybe multiple spots where we see pictures of families? Children can walk in and see pictures that are representative of them. And that's another really essential element. And then we're thinking about those expectations and the rules. Have they been developed, defined, taught, retaught, practiced, and of course, commented on positively when they're demonstrated. Same thing with our rules and looking at our rules by activity, especially if we have an activity where there might be some more likelihood of challenging behavior occurring. Have we really taught what those rules are? So this is another document. You could use it as a self-assessment that really builds off of what I just talked about in the previous slide. It could be used as a coaching tool, but it really breaks down for you what is meant by those 5 or 6 classroom essentials. And again, you can find that on challengingbehavior.org. All right, so we're looking at, if you are going to go to the website, looking for at trainers and largely at the section that is around resources. There is another option in terms of receiving training, and it's the ePyramid learning modules. They are available for preschool along with infant and toddler, if that's something that you are also supporting. But it goes through what is nurturing and responsive relationships, what are those different tiers, along with some other some other modules around culturally responsive practices, looking at trauma-informed care and the pyramid model, how did the two intersect, and then also a course on self-care, right? So making sure that we're taking care of ourselves. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about this targeted social emotional supports, and thinking that we remember that we teach all children these skills, but we also recognize that there's might be children who need some additional supports, some additional instruction or practice, or even visual cues. So what we mean by social emotional learning, we teach children skills for self-regulation, how to handle those really big emotions. We teach children to understand emotions and how do we express them, how do we recognize them in other people. How can we problem solve some of those common social situations that we see in our classroom? What are ways that we can learn to independently problem solve some of those things? And then skills for really building social relationships so that all children are able to have friends in the classroom, have peers that they enjoy playing with, and just making sure that when we think about walking through the room and feeling really welcomed, that all children have the skills to do that. Then we have explicit instruction for some. So when I mentioned that, the second layer, we're thinking about increased opportunities for instruction. So maybe I have a smaller group of children who practice taking turns or practice asking a friend how to play. And then they get lots more positive descriptive feedback after they've demonstrated what's been instructed. But the key part too is really practicing. We think about anything that we teach in school, we don't just do it once and we don't do it just one way. If we taught reading like that, it would really not be successful at all. We think of different ways of teaching. We think of different ways of children understanding, different places to practice, and of course that positive feedback. And then when we talk about family partnerships in this instance, we're thinking of if we are practicing how to ask a friend to play, how can we help families to know those steps, understand them, and help them to include that at home, or maybe on activities that they do in the community. And we also think about how do we progress monitor what we're teaching, and using data to really make decisions on areas that maybe need a little more focus, or maybe we need to change a little bit of our instruction. So when we think about friendship skills for young children, we're thinking about some of these bullets. So play organizing, so it's giving children suggestions of how to interact with materials. We teach children how do they share toys or other materials, and then really how do you take turns. So what does that look like? How do we handle it when somebody doesn't want to share? So we teach them explicitly kinds of things that we would like to see them do. How can we help our friends? We're thinking about when we're thinking about friendship skills, we're thinking about giving compliments, understanding how and when to give an apology. So it's not just telling a child to say, I'm sorry. We're really helping them to understand, how do I give an apology and when would it be appropriate for me to do that? And when we teach all of these things, we see children begin to empathize with other children. They start to be able to recognize emotions in others and in their friends. So perhaps if they aren't taking turns as well as they need to be, they can start to understand and see if their friend is getting frustrated. So when we talk about asking a friend to play, we can teach them these 4 steps and the visuals that go along with it. We can help them to practice this. We help them with either starting with the child, practicing with an adult, and then practicing with another child. So you can see it breaks it down for them, tapping their friend on the shoulder, taking their friend by the hand, saying, let's play, or giving the friend a toy to share. When we're thinking about emotional literacy, we're thinking about how do we identify emotions in ourselves and somebody else? How do we understand emotions and express those in a healthy way? And if you think about where we started out, that we expect meltdowns are going to happen just by the age of children that we are supporting and teaching, when we are able to teach them words and for emotions and how to identify those and how to handle those big emotions, we see a lot less challenging behavior. And I always think of walking into classrooms when teachers will say to children, use your words. And sometimes if you ask them, well, what words have you taught them? And they'll say no words. So then you can see why that might not work. But if we teach them the words and have them practice the words, then when we say that, they actually have some vocabulary to draw on. So you might have seen some of these resources before, but a lot of them had a major makeover in the past 2 years. So this is how I feel today. So a little feelings check-in, but you can see the pictures are no longer those cartoony pictures. They are pictures of actual children. And then the feeling wheel, if that's something that you were also familiar with, both of these are updated along with lots of other resources around emotions, so that you can see the feeling wheel has a range of emotions. It's not just all happy or sad. And then it comes with some instructions for how to use it if you're not already familiar with it. So when we think about self-regulation, we think about those really big emotions that children have and how can we help them to regulate it? And what would that look like in different settings? And what would that look like in different activities? Anger management is the ability to calm down and regulate emotions when angry or upset. So we really need to make sure we're teaching children those skills. And we know that these skills can transfer into multiple activities, multiple situations, multiple settings. So before they're able to really problem solve, remember that's going to be our next item, goes back to understanding feelings. So recognizing anger in oneself and others, how to calm down before the emotions get elevated. What are some appropriate ways? We know people get angry, we know children are going to get angry, but what are some appropriate ways to express that? And then helping them to understand that when they are angry, it might interfere with their ability to problem solve. And I think as an adult, as a teacher in the room, that's really important for us to consider. So this is just a quick picture of how one teacher, it's nothing fancy, but very doable and very important. They talk about what it feels like to be angry, with their heart beating fast, muscles shake, calm down, and then what can you do? So they had the children identify what are different things that they could do. So you can see at the bottom one said take a nap, and then they have some different things that would work for them. But I think it's really important for us to not only talk about what to do when we're angry, but to recognize it before it elevates. So here's another resource for you in thinking about there's not just one way of calming down. We don't need to teach every single way, but we would want to offer some options because it's definitely not a one size fits all approach. Some children might prefer deep breaths while others prefer counting or drawing a picture. But this is a good document to think about. Maybe you've taught some strategies and they're not clicking with a particular child. You might want to think about what are some other options, what are some other things I can do when teach them to be able to regulate those big emotions. So you might also recognize this, got a little bit of a complete makeover. When we talk about smell the flower, blow the pinwheel, these are things that we have to teach children to do. So we help them to remember how to take deep breaths, remember how to inhale and exhale. Because if you ever ask a child to do that, if you haven't taught them already, a lot of times they'll just inhale and hold their breath, not really understanding when they're supposed to exhale. So we have to make sure that we're specifically teaching that. And Tucker Turtle also got a makeover. When we're thinking about Tucker Turtle, we're thinking about him taking time to think. So there's those 4 steps. So it's important. We already taught them emotions. So this first step is to recognize your feelings, to stop your body, to tuck in your shell and take 3 deep breaths. And then when you're calm, you can come out and think of a solution. So there's the scripted or social story that goes along with it to help teach children. The wonderful thing about Tucker too is you can take 3 deep breaths anywhere. So if that's a strategy you teach children, they can do it in multiple settings. All right. And there is some instruction around how do we teach problem solving steps. And these are the problem solving steps that we would teach children. So how do they problem solve in some common situations that occur in the classroom, helping them understand the different steps, helping them think of what solutions would be and evaluate those, and then to give them a try. So this is also a resource that got updated. So here are some of the solutions to the solution kit. So it's not enough for us. We can't assume children are going to come up with their own solution. So we teach them what are some different possibilities, what situations would it be appropriate for, and thinking about how do we systematically teach this. So we wouldn't want to introduce everything at once. What works in our classroom or what makes sense for our classroom. So there's a lot of different options to think about. And then the big thing when for all of this thinking of social and emotional competencies is that we introduce that new skill or concept, but we really need to make sure we're practicing it so that children are fluent with it, that they're able to use that skill without a prompt, or some of our children might need that extra prompt. So we practice, not a one time, and it's not one time a year. It's all throughout the year, all throughout the day, all throughout the year. And then we want to make sure that they maintain that skill. So it might be something that we taught in October. We're going to expect to keep seeing it November, December. We're going to help them to generalize that skill too. So we're thinking about, you have the skill, how are you going to use it in different situations, different settings with different people. And then we have to practice those things as well. But it is just the greatest thing when you see a child generalize those skills to different settings. All right. So if you were looking for some additional materials, like I said, I would go to resources and you'll be able to find everything that we talked about. Here's the little drop down for teaching social emotional skills. You can tell that there's also other resources. As I mentioned, this is definitely not exhaustive of everything that's there, but don't feel like you have to go out and start creating things because there are lots and lots of materials that are ready for you to print that you could do tomorrow. So in the chat box, I'd like you to just type in what is one resource you want to try out in your classroom or school. And it doesn't even have to be a resource. It could be one of the strategies or one of the targeted social emotional skills that were mentioned, but we're interested to know what you would like to try out. Right, so I'm going to hand it off to Lisa, and I'll let you type in chat about the resources while we switch out.
Great. Am I good to go?
I see a little bit. Yes, now you are.
All right, I was frozen for a minute. So Anna's walked us through what you might think about as tier 1 or tier 2. These are practices though. So we're talking about universal practices and then some of the prevention practices with social emotional teaching. So just to kind of round it out, what do we do for kids who present with persistent challenging behavior, those few children? And they're distinguished from kids who come with meltdowns, everyday meltdowns, because we expect those, but we also know that some kids come with persistent challenging behavior and we need to be ready to support them. And so at that level, we're thinking about a comprehensive intervention approach using individualized positive behavior support, using functional assessment, doing it as a collaborative team with the teacher and the family at the center of the team, doing that in partnership. And our focus, of course, is on skill building, on providing that child with replacement skills for the challenging behavior. And so the process that we know that has significant evidence behind it is pull a team together, conduct a functional assessment, identify your hypothesis, and then develop a behavior support plan. And as much as we can in early childhood, we want to think about, are there parallels, problems that are happening in home and community, and how do we assist families in addressing those as we go through this process? So we really want to be joining with families as we do this. There is a manualized approach that we strongly support people look at and think about adopting. It just makes it so much easier. And it's Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for young children. You might be familiar with Prevent, Teach, Reinforce, period, which came first and was really developed for students in elementary schools. Prevent, Teach, Reinforce for young children draws on the literature in early childhood and is really specific to the preschool classroom. But again, it uses science of individualized positive behavior support and functional assessment for this work. So in terms of behavior intervention resources that also you can find on our website, so resources for individualized interventions, including a little case study, sample plan, some guides that we've developed of how you do assessment, functional assessment, and develop behavior support plans, and some more information for you to use as we think about our youngest learners in that work. So if you are done putting what you just put in the chat, which were the resource you aim to use around social emotional teaching, if you could share with your colleagues, what strategies or what resources are you using around young children with persistent challenging behavior? And I think people might be interested to know if you have used PTRYC and if you found it to be effective for your teams and easy to implement within school contexts. So let's talk a little bit then about what we've done so far is run through the framework of evidence-based practices. And so that's what's in the guts of our triangle, right? That's what's in there are all of these practices. And I know if you're new to this, it may be a little bit overwhelming to think about. And of course, identifying the practices is really critically important, and training teachers to be able to implement the practices are critically important. But in PBIS, we also think about the systems pieces, right? The systems pieces to put evidence-based practices in place. And so when we're thinking about an early childhood school, for example, some school districts have a dedicated early childhood center, right? And so they're going to need to think about their systems piece, their implementation infrastructure. When we bring the pyramid model to Head Start or childcare, which are dedicated standalone early childhood programs, we're going to need to think about the implementation infrastructure. And so we do that with a leadership team similar to school-wide PBIS. If this is pre-K classrooms on the campus of a school, then we want the school-wide team to be thinking about these elements as they probably are already, as they think about their supports for all students and how to deliver evidence-based practices or intervention tiers. So for our early childhood programs that don't have a team already because they're not school-wide PBIS, you might actually have oversight of some of those programs. We're going to work to establish a leadership team and have that leadership team think about staff buy-in, family engagement, program-wide expectations, what's their procedures for responding to persistent challenging behavior and using data for decision-making, and providing continuous professional development with instructional coaching. There's no way around it. We're going to have to be able to provide coaching to our programs. So I want to unpack these pieces a little bit and show you where the resources are, where you can think about each of these pieces and learn a little bit more what we mean by that. Before I do that, I'm going to share with you this video of a principal who's brand new in charge of a early childhood center program, public school, and how excited she was after their first year of implementation of the pyramid model, kind of using all of this structure that I'm sharing with you and helping teachers implement those practices we just reviewed.
For me personally, what I'm most proud of is the fact that I no longer have that internal feeling of helplessness when a child is in need. I am so appreciative of what the model has given us to support student achievement. We are pyramid proud.
So they have a tool, we provide a tool. You might be familiar with the school-wide benchmarks of quality. We have an early childhood program-wide benchmarks of quality, and that really helps our teams, like the team we just heard from, know what it is they're putting in place, how to put it in place, and monitor their progress in implementing that. So you can find all kinds of program-wide resources on our website. That tool is there. You'll also find a manual that leadership teams use to go through each piece of the tool and know what to put in place. And then on our data page, they actually have an Excel spreadsheet so they can track their progress with their implementation plan. So what if it's a classroom at your school? What are we doing around our pre-K classrooms, making sure they're really on board? And that may be our early childhood special ed classrooms that include children as young as 3 with disabilities. It may be our public pre-K classrooms. And it may be Head Start classrooms that are on our campus or in our elementary school building. And we have heard from some schools, it's like, okay, we're all on board, but I can't get that pre-K teacher on board. And so on our website, we have created this fact sheet to give you some strategies of how to think about that. First of all, we think it's really important that we get representation and voice of the pre-K on the district team and on the school team. So if you haven't done that, that could be a part of kind of your buy-in puzzle, right? Is getting them there. We need to acknowledge the differences. So there's some different ways. Anna reviewed those differences in developmental stage, the differences in the classroom. There are also going to be differences in how we do acknowledgement for meeting expectations. They're not going to be doing token economies because for little ones, token economies aren't developmentally appropriate. We're not going to be using office discipline referral data because we don't send little ones. You don't tell children who are 3 to pack up their sippy cup and truck off to the office to meet with the dean of students, right? And then we are going to want to pay attention to the pyramid practices. Tons of resources for you to help teachers in terms of training so that when they receive professional development, it really resonates with what they know are best practices in a preschool classroom, and then using the appropriate measures and tools. So think about that if you're struggling a little bit in getting your pre-K teachers on board with your school-wide work. And maybe you right now could share with your colleagues, what have you done if you're in a school that has pre-K classrooms? What have you done to make sure that pre-K teachers have gotten on the bus for school-wide PBIS and are fully engaged in the initiative? And then I'd encourage you to go to the website also to look at this fact sheet. So we do have distinctive data tools that we want to consider using in our work. And so we have the benchmarks of quality we just mentioned. We have a tool that examines the implementation of the practices. I'll share a little bit more with you about that. And we have a tool to look at children's behavior incidents that really replaces the notion of office discipline referrals as the metric to use. We're really excited that PBIS apps has picked that up as early childhood Swiss. And so they offer that as early childhood Swiss. If you don't know about that, tune into it. It's really fabulous. We also have it on an Excel spreadsheet for our programs that don't use Swiss, who just want to pick up some things easier and without expense to be able to implement in their programs. And so in addition to our tools, we also offer some of that more deeper dive, like the program-wide PBIS benchmarks of quality culturally responsive companion. Boy, that's a mouthful. We did that in collaboration with PBIS. And if you've used the one for K through 12 program, you know that these guides are to really help you be deeply reflective on issues of equity and culturally responsive practices in your program-wide implementation. And then I want to point out, if you want to know more about the whole set of tools that we have, go to the roadmap on our website for data decision-making and our data page. And all of our tools are in Excel format, but they're all there for free so that you can access them and use those in the program. So something for you to explore more. In the program-wide implementation, then it's a leadership team that really thinks about the family engagement and develops the implementation infrastructure to make that happen. So it's not just up to every individual teacher, but as a program, this is what we do. And it starts with getting that parent on the leadership team, right? So all of this notion of being on the leadership team and thinking about how do we operate our program in a manner that really fully supports family engagement. I just read a recent research study on suspension and expulsion in Illinois, where they actually have a law around that, prohibiting suspension and expulsion of young children. It was interesting. They found that in programs where there was better climate of family engagement and principles that strongly endorse that, they found much less use of exclusionary discipline. So on the website, tons of materials to help you kind of tackle that, including fact sheets. How do you invite the family member to be on the leadership team and what's their role? And then a letter to them about what that's about. Of course, information that you want to give to all families, that you're doing the pyramid model and what that's about. And then if children are going to receive a behavior support plan, we have a handout for them to understand what to expect and what their role is in the process. Anna mentioned our positive solutions materials. So that's materials that a school counselor, a social worker, family service worker, it depends on the nature of your program, could run a parent group for parents of preschool age children around promoting their social emotional skills and addressing problem behavior. So it's a 7-session group. All the materials are packaged. The materials are for you as the facilitator of that group. And we've had one little randomized study on the group with really wonderful effects and tons of anecdotal and social validity data on the importance of the groups and its power in helping families feel supported and have strategies to use in home in the community. We also offer these backpack connections in many languages now that are really a lovely bridge piece. So teachers can send these home, or the school could do it uniformly across their pre-K classrooms. And each one of them describes what we teach in the program around behavior, schedules and routines, and social skills, and how the parent can address that at home. So it's this really lovely bridge piece that is a constant connection of what do we do between school and how can you support it at home. Tons of materials for families. I think this was our major pandemic effort because that's where kids were with their families. And so we'd encourage you to go to the family engagement page and really explore everything that we have there that your staff can be using in supporting families. So as you think about what I just shared, why don't you put in chat a resource you plan to use, or you might share with your colleagues a resource that you've discovered and are using that has been helpful in your program. I'm going to keep going so we have time for questions because we're really eager to hear what you want to know more about. So Anna ran through a ton of kind of information about practices. And what we would say to you is, in our aim to have people to implement evidence-based practices, there needs to be at some place where they know what the list is, right? Where they know what it is you're expecting to see, what I ought to be doing to implement the framework. And so we do have, and we use this with teachers for them to reflect on the practices, to identify their strengths, really in a strengths assessment, and then to indicate which practices they want to work on or want to have more information about. So this is a really nice tool to use in coaching and in a training context. With the pyramid model, we pretty much recommend that you plan for doing classroom coaching. And I know that's hard to come to because it's so resource intensive, although we would say to you, there's an integrity of a coaching cycle and framework that we recommend you use that has been developed from the research literature, but it actually can be delivered in various ways. But we know that coaching is really important for helping people implement practices in the classroom. And so the framework I'm referring to is called practice-based coaching. And there have been almost a dozen randomized trials of the use of this framework around different sets of practices, pyramid model, some behavioral practices, and instructional practices. And the framework that was designed, called practice-based coaching, was based on everything we know in the literature about components of effective coaching. And so if you already are trained in instructional coaching, you might be looking at this and saying, this looks super familiar, and it should, right? Because it's those critical components. That you have a partnership, you identify what the practices are, they're in the center, you develop an action plan, you conduct observations, and you engage in reflection and both supportive and constructive feedback. So we have a guide around how do you do practice-based coaching on our website, the Classroom Practitioner Coaching Guide, and also a guide for the leadership team, because we know coaching is resource intensive. We know it's kind of organizationally a lot to think about. How will we coach? Who will get coached? How will coaching be delivered? Should we do a live coaching and virtual coaching? Might we want to consider group coaching? And so the guide for the program leadership team really helps leadership teams think about all those critical questions and gives them some guidance about what they might want to do. When we do coaching, we have a fidelity tool that we use. We always start there to understand teachers' strengths and teachers' needs in the practices and to be able to monitor teachers' progress. And so it's called the Teaching Pyramid Observation Tool. One of the nice things about the Teaching Pyramid Observation Tool is that data display that can help leadership teams understand where their teachers are, can help leadership teams plan future professional development, acknowledge where growth has been. So for example, in this one, what pops for me right away is teachers still aren't probably where we want to be in teaching problem solving. And so that might be what I highlight, and aren't where we might want them to be around supporting family use of pyramid practices. And I might be thinking then thoughtfully about professional development or things we could do as a leadership team to move that along. So here's a coach from that program. We were just heard from the principal talking about her practice-based
practice-based coaching is the model that I use working with my teachers in regards to a pyramid model. And that looks like the first step is really assessing the needs of the classroom, meeting with the teacher, letting them know what's going to happen, what the cycles look like. And then I usually schedule my teapot after that first meeting. And the teapot really gives me a full picture of the classroom. And then when we meet again to debrief the teapot observation, at that point, then we can work together collaboratively on action planning and goal setting. So that would kind of conclude step one. And then I would come back, we'd set our goal, we'd set another meeting for a more focused observation. We would debrief that again, and then we would look at the cycle, look at the observations, see if there were more strategies that we can put in the classroom, brainstorm ideas together for support, and it's a cyclical fashion. So we set the goal, we plan how we're going to achieve the goal, and then we come back and debrief.
One of the resources we also have for our coaching is a resource to begin to examine issues related to equity and implicit bias. And so we actually have a guide for coaches to use to be able to think about where teachers are in their use of practices across all children, each and every child, to identify whether or not there are issues, prepare for having what could be a difficult conversation with a teacher, prepare for it, be ready with resources, and then be ready to figure out how they'll engage in coaching around those issues, and a reflection and feedback. So this guide is something we're super excited about offering to people, and folks have found it really useful as they work harder collectively on addressing equity in their program. So finally, I wanted to highlight the BIR system. I mentioned it as a data system, as an alternative to tracking office discipline referrals, because of course, we're not sending preschoolers to the office. And in many ways, our major minor forms are not structured for the context, the unique context of an early childhood classroom. And so we created a behavior incident report system to capture those behavior incidents that really concern us, with the goal of supporting the child and the teacher. And also understanding if people are using exclusionary discipline, and then understanding that through the lens of equity. So it's on challengingbehavior.org for free. It's also in PBIS apps as EC Swiss. Again, I want to highlight that it's different. It's going to feel very similar, which is amazing because of the great work that our colleagues have done with the Swiss system, but it is measuring something that's different. So it tracks, it analyzes the behavior incidents. The Excel spreadsheet generates all the graphs you need to use. Of course, EC Swiss will do that as well. And it allows for a deeper dive all the way down to the child level, across teachers, across children. But what we're measuring is different, right? It's different than a decision that a child violated school norms. It's measuring a behavior incident that a teacher finds concerning. So it's exceeding the intensity, frequency, or duration that exceeds what's developmentally expected for a young child, because we don't expect 3, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds even to come to preschool already knowing what the social norms are and being able to adhere to them. They're in the middle of developing their understanding of social norms and how to meet people's expectations. So to wrap up, I'm saving time so you can have questions, and hopefully people have put those in the section of the website where you're supposed to put them. Polls is where you're supposed to put them. And what you can put in there are any questions you have for us, or you could put resources you can't find, or you want to know if we have, or anything, ideas that we've put out here that you want to ask about. So a couple of the big ideas. First of all, the pyramid model brings the framework of evidence-based practices to use in your early childhood PBIS implementation. So that's what it is. It's not something that's different. It's the framework of practices. The core elements of PBIS, those circles, the systems, the practices, and the use of data decision-making are the same in our early childhood classrooms as they are in our K through 12. And so that is the science of behavior change. And then I think the other really big idea is that we've got to stay in those big concepts, right? And then think about what does that implementation then look like for our littlest learners, for the littlest ones that are in our school classrooms. The pyramid model, our work, Anna and I and our colleagues at NCPMI, our lens is on kids birth to 5. So we've even gone earlier. What does it look like for infants? What does it look like for toddlers? What does it look like for preschoolers? But it's all based on that science that we learned through, the last 20, 30 years of PBIS work. So Megan, do we have any questions?
There are a few questions. I do want to summarize that resources, there were lots of resources that people identified, and many of them were about families. And so that was a theme that we got. The links to those family implementation direct link to those resources are up. Backpack Connections got lots of interest. But there was one great question in the chat that I thought I would pass it to Anna because it falls in line with the classroom environments that she talked about. And a lot of the conversation was, well, what might this look like in our first grade and kindergarten classrooms? And someone asked about visuals. What kind of visuals work best for our youngest learners in elementary? It looks different than maybe what we might have in a pre-K classroom. So Anna, do you want to give a little comment and thought on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that one of the great things about visuals in thinking about pre-K, we're supporting children who don't know how to read yet, right? And even when we're thinking about kindergarten, first, second, we know that there's still going to be a need and support for visuals if we're really going to be inclusive and meet the needs of all children. When we're thinking about earlier, I just reflected when I was a teacher and my older students saying, well, that's really baby, right? And that was always something that they hated to see. In terms of taking pictures of your actual classroom, engaging in, if you're looking at a visual schedule, engaging in those activities, demonstrating those rules, thinking about what are those behavior expectations? Is there a need for an additional visual or a prompt? And then just using, if you actually use pictures of the children that you are teaching in your classroom, in and of itself will just demonstrate, it will just look older, right? Because if we're thinking about a second grade classroom, it's going to look a lot different than a pre-K classroom. So I feel like there are some needs visually, but the principles behind it would still be the same. You're still creating that predictable environment. And I think it's really important for kindergarten, first, second. I actually think it's important throughout, but a lot of this would translate very nicely into those classrooms. I don't know, Lisa, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, you said, I think it's good for on up. We as adults use visuals constantly in environments. Yes. And if you go to a new environment, you use visuals to scan, to understand what you're supposed to do, what's coming up next. And we get anxious when we don't know, right? Mm-hmm. We want it. So I think there are lots of ways we can use icons that are available, anything to kind of give kids a sense. I think all kids need to know what is expected of me right now, what's coming next, how do I know if I'm, meeting your expectations. So.
And there was one additional question about, I think it's great. I tried to answer it in the chat, but it doesn't always land when you're giving the answer. It was about, are there prepared lesson plans through challengingbehavior.org on NCPMI's website? I tried to answer that there's resources and materials that can be used in creating lesson plans, but do you want to share a little bit more about implementation of what some of those resources and tools might look like in I think people are thinking about, okay, in our kindergarten, first grade, young classrooms.
Did you want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. So we're thinking about the fact that it's not a lesson plan, right? It's resources, because you want to think about the unique needs of your classroom and your school culture. But I like the idea of, or at least maybe I read into this, and the question of how do we embed it in what we're teaching. And when you look through the resources, especially thinking about emotions, thinking about friendship skills, thinking about problem solving, all of those fit really nicely into, we had a teacher who did a science lesson and incorporated the problem solving process in that, because she purposely set up materials that there weren't enough, or there was one she knew people preferred. So she used that as an opportunity. So I think if you look at what you already are required to do for your curriculum, and I'm going to guess most folks here do have that requirement, looking for places that might naturally fit. So of course, literature is always a good place where we can pause and ask questions, even if it's not something specific about those areas. We can think about how the character feels. If we're doing, even if we're looking at math, we could think about, is there a way that we could incorporate thinking about, what do I do when I get frustrated because I can't figure out a problem? All of those kind of self-regulation skills are really helpful for older students too, because they face different kinds of frustrations. It's no longer not being able to communicate so much as it might be an academic frustration. Still important to know how to handle it when it happens. I think that would be my not exhaustive, but my short answer.
I think that, we talk about social emotional learning is all day, every day. And you can do a planned lesson. And I think most teachers know how to structure that, with a book, with materials. You can also pull in a curriculum like Second Step or one of those things. But what those don't do, right? So that helps you with acquisition. That little 15-minute or 30-minute helps you with initial acquisition. What then you want to do is really thread that instruction in the way that Anna has said, that it's threaded through activities, and figure out how to refer back to it, how to pull it back in, and monitor, have children had enough practice opportunities to really learn this skill that I'm trying to teach them? And am I bridging that child then to generalize the use of it? So yeah, we worked on self-regulation, and now the child is going into the math worksheet, and they're likely to be frustrated, and you prime them to think about what is the skill we learned how to do and how might you use it.
So there are two questions. The polls were not working and I was stalling, and now they are working. So we do have some questions. We have two questions that are about universal reinforcers and token economies at being like what's appropriate for pre-K. And so that kind of is the question, are universal reinforcers or token economies appropriate for pre-K? That seemed to come up in a few of the questions.
So everybody likes getting a prize. They're so much fun, right? I like getting a prize. But our goal in the token economy is to motivate students, right? So really they need to understand that by doing X, I get this. And what we see with preschoolers is they'll get a ticket and they're happy they have a ticket, or they have tickets in their pocket and they don't know what the tickets are for. And so that whole piece is really not a match for where they are developmentally. And I think what we want to do is use what works and what helps children, right, feel reinforced, notice that, to be able to understand that they did the thing that was the expectation and motivated to continue to do it. And for preschoolers, that can be a happy dance, a high five, a thumbs up, a pat on the back. Of course, you're going to tailor it based on the individual child. And so we would recommend that you not use your token economies individually with children. Children are pretty vulnerable in their social understanding. So the idea that Megan got a ticket, but I didn't get a ticket because I didn't do anything today that was actionable is going to be really hard. That you're going to trigger a meltdown for no reason at all, except the child doesn't quite get it. Like, how does this work and how am I a part of it? If you want to use a reward system, then you might do collective rewards, which might have the whole class celebrate. And maybe we're putting pom-poms in a jar every time someone meets an expectation, and then we do something fun. And so it gives us another time to remember what our expectations are and what we're working towards. So we'll do acknowledgement systems that are visual, that like pom-pom jars, or putting construction paper loops every time a child engages in expectation. And soon we have a big construction paper chain of loops all over. We put bears outside our classroom, and we have so many, it joins with the other classroom. So we can still do celebrations and acknowledgements without kind of going down to token economies that aren't a match for where kids are developmentally. Anna, do you have other thoughts on the?
I was just thinking too, if you do a school-wide celebration, thinking about how could you incorporate, not that they have to earn it, but that they could be a part of it. What might be appropriate that way. Also too, if those pre-K students are going to roll up to kindergarten, then they sort of have seen a little bit of, what's the school-wide celebration? What does that mean? I was just thinking about one school-wide celebration was a movie, and the pre-K came in and they got their popcorn. They didn't sit and watch the movie, but they got their popcorn, and then they went back but they, like, oh, we're gonna go see all of these students, and they like clapped for them or something like that. But then just to continue to keep in mind, we don't want to be that island. We don't want our classrooms to sit by themselves feeling like they're isolated.
So I think that probably answered a lot of people's questions. There were quite a few around that. The last question, I'm looking at time, and maybe this will be our last question, is about the idea of, are office referrals acceptable for littlest ones? And so that is the question that someone is asking. It's in the context of, at what point does a pre-K teacher, should they send students to the office for misbehavior, hitting, running around? They're describing challenging behavior. So do you want to provide some insight into that question?
So I'll start in asking and to also take on. So absolutely, you need to get help, right? So that would be the purpose of the office discipline referral, is to engage someone else that helps you navigate this. But sending the child out of the room isn't necessarily the way to access help, right? So we would advise that there's a system when I have a concern about a child, that I can get assistance with that child. And hopefully that assistance is within the classroom. If the child is in a crisis situation and we would have you either move children away from the child, or the child away from other children if the child is engaging in dangerous behavior. But I don't see the value or the purpose in sending a child to the office. And I do think that in the early years, that when children are sent out of the room, and we have other children witnessed in that, other children who are developing a sense of who they are and who other children are, and who belongs and who doesn't belong, that because you became unglued and you had a major meltdown and you couldn't stop crying, you're pushed out. You're pushed out of instruction, you're pushed out of belonging. And I think doing that is harmful to kids. It's harmful to that little one who's developing a sense of themselves in relationship to others. And it's reinforcing some biases and perceptions of children by the children who aren't engaging in problem behavior. Anna, do you have thoughts about it?
No, I was just going to reiterate what you said of what's the purpose, right? What is it? What is the reason? What is the purpose behind writing that referral? Because just as Lisa just mentioned, it's not going to make sense to that child. It's not teaching them anything. And I think if teachers stop and examine why they're doing it, they might see that there's an alternative. It just could be habit, but it's definitely not recommended.
But with the BIR and in your programs, people have created systems where if a child has like 3 BIRs in a week, then they get a consultation. So we are paying attention to the delivery of differentiated intervention, right?
Yes, absolutely. The BIR is a really great way to capture that information that's useful in planning of, how am I going to support this child if that's the case, or what do I need to change around my instruction or environment if that's the case.
I think we're at time, and we've had the evaluation slide up for a while, so I hope everyone's paying attention. And I don't know if there's a speech we're supposed to give with the evaluation slide.
I think we're just encouraging you to evaluate.
It's listed in the chat box. I know you can't all see the chat box, but it is posted there for everyone to click on.
Terrific.
Thank you all for coming.
Yes,
Have a
thank
great
you so
rest of your
much.
conference.